But Ed lived to be 100 years and 18 days. He always told me, I'm going to live to be 100. And 100 years and 18 days. And at his 100th birthday, he was still sharp as a dadgum tack. All the brothers and sisters and nephews and all, we had a little party for him out on Scott's patio. And he was just as sharp as he could be on things.
Them Deumites, y'all got this, y'all got that gene on you that, I mean, for 90, you look great and sound great. I mean, y'all got something.
You see, my second brother, Lewis, died when he was 97. And my sister was 95.
How old did your parents live to?
My dad died when he was 78. He had a heart attack, and my mom died at 88.
So is your mom's genetics really
Yeah.
probably stronger?
Yeah, because Mom had uncles that were over 100 years old.
Some people say you're just hitting your stride right now, Norman.
I was born, the life expectancy of a male was 52. So I've had a lot of lanyard in my time. I don't know who quoted the deal, but I don't think I've ever met a stranger. I usually initiate. I still do. We went out and got a pizza last night, and ended up being friends with the people at the next table on talking about things and all. Did Will Rogers say that? I never met a guy I didn't like.
I forget who said that.
I think it was Will Rogers, because I'm the Will Rogers of food. I never met a food I didn't like.
Did you have a pretty healthy relationship with food?
Man, like I say, if it's there, I'll eat. Kay says, "What do you want?" I says, "Put it on the table, whatever it is." And that's kind of strange because my mom was such a fantastic cook that you think I'd be a little bit picky, but I'm not. Well, Oberlin is a little town of only about 1,200 people. Growing up, I remember growing up, lived in a little house that was not painted. The only running water in the house was in the kitchen. There's no electricity, no gas. It was just a small little country town. Oberlin is between Lake Charles and Alexandria on Highway 165. It's about 40 miles from Alexandria and about 35 miles to Lake Charles. My dad was first generation. He came here when he was 16 years old and lived with his first cousin and worked for them till he accumulated enough, and then he opened up his own little store. He had a grocery store. My mom grew up in Church Point. I think she was probably third generation in America. Her father was French and German, and her mother was German, French, and English. And my grandfather was a carpenter, so he moved to Oberlin. There were several little projects that they'd ask him to come bid on. One of them was a church and a parish hall, and that's what he did his whole lifetime at Oberlin.
You think that's where you got your mentality for construction? I mean,
it probably is. I remember I'd go to some of the places that he was working, and in order to keep me out of trouble, he'd give me a couple of 2x4s and a hammer and a sack of nails, and I just stayed there all day just nailing nails and 2x4s and all. Back then, all those guys came here, all they were looking for was an opportunity. They just knew things. What made my dad leave Lebanon was the Muslims were really taking over Lebanon and Syria and those places through there. And of course, he was Christian. And it was an escape for him to get, and since he had relatives here. And it was always strange. The only other person that came here, my dad's brother came here. He lived in Eunice, but he had another brother that lived in Lebanon, and they never came, and he never went back. I always asked him, "You going to go?" Nope. He never had the desire to go back to Lebanon. I think about my dad came here. He was 16 years old. He worked for my uncle, and when the First World War started, he joined the Army. and they sent him to France, and he was in the Battle of the Argonne. Came back and worked for my uncle again until he accumulated enough money to go in business. But he was probably one of the most patriotic guys that I ever knew. Man, he belonged to the VFW, the American Legion. And you know, when he first came here, my uncle was an immigrant, and immigrants were all suspect on things then. People didn't quite trust him or anything else. And they were all pretty good businessmen, and they came into little towns and they opened businesses and got successful really quick, and they couldn't figure out how they were doing it. And they didn't really like them. And I remember my uncle built up a big business, and sometimes he was threatened about things. And part of what my dad did working for him was at night, he was kind of like the night watchman, because my uncle was very successful. He had a big general merchandise store, a furniture store, a lumber yard, had property all over the place. And going from where people had suspect, my daddy ended up being elected as mayor of the town and served as mayor of the town for 20 years. You know, we didn't have a car, so we didn't take too many vacations on things. Sometimes on Sundays, with my uncle, we'd drive to, places, Lake Charles or New Iberia or Lafayette or Alexander to visit relatives or so. And that was a big deal. Get up dark Sunday morning, get in the car and drive there, have dinner, and drive back home. But it was, I think they did more to keep up with their relatives than we do now. Some of them live across town. You haven't seen them in 6 months.
Not like you could pick up the phone and call them back then. So y'all did eventually, you didn't have a car growing up, but eventually your dad got one, is that right? What?
My dad had a car before I was born, and decided it was too dangerous to drive. And the first car I remember in our family, my older brother bought a car when he got back out of the Navy. He worked in Oakdale, so he needed a car. He worked for a bank, and that was the first car I remember in my family.
That wasn't Uncle Ed, huh?
No, that was Lewis.
How many cars were there even in Oberlin?
When I was growing up in Oberlin, there were 2 cars. Miss Fuselier had a car and Mr. Karam had a car, and that was it.
You were what number of the kids?
I was number 5. I had, there was Ed, Ailey, Lewis, Ruth, me, and then the younger one, Philip.
Y'all would go to church? I mean, tell me about your religious and faith upbringing.
Well, my daddy was a religious man, and my mom was even more religious. But my mom said 3 to 5 rosaries every day of her life when she got to be older. And, holy days and Sundays, there wasn't any doubt whether you were going to Mass or not, you were going. And, faith was a big part of everybody's life back then. Oberlin was a small town, 1,200 people. But think about it. They had a Catholic church, they had a Methodist church, they had a Presbyterian church, they had a Pentecostal church.
So what were you looking for in a spouse when you were younger? What'd you like? Personality, dance, looks? What?
Yeah, everything. I was looking for the whole package.
Did Kay deliver?
She did. She's been a great wife. Put up with me for 64 years. She's been a great wife. Kay was a beautiful girl. My God, boy, she could dance like crazy and just sweet, had a great personality. It perked my interest in a hurry. And I think about 8 months later, we were married.
But back then when you married somebody, you thought that you'd be with them forever.
It was a commitment. There's some rocky times in every marriage that I believe. I don't know if I've only been in one, but I can tell by my friends. But a commitment doesn't say till things get rocky or something else. When we lived on Drew Court, we had 3 kids and all 3 of them in baby beds. Think about that. All 3 of them were in baby beds. That's how close together they were.
Did you change diapers?
Oh, I changed many of diapers. That was my deal every night. When I came, because I'd leave early, go to work in the morning, I'd come back late in the afternoon, so I didn't really get a chance to spend time with the kids. But every night, I would bathe them and dress them for bed. That was my deal.
You had 3 boys, and I know it was easy rearing boys. You throw, especially with that creek, you throw them a truck and some dirt. Stacy came, she was the 3rd one. That was a little different for you, huh, Norman?
A little bit. I tell you what, Stacy is too much like her dad on things. Stacy has an opinion on everything, and she don't mind telling you that either.
What'd you think when she decided to name her firstborn Steve? How'd you?
I never forget, she was in women's hospital, and they brought the baby in, and she says his name is Steve. Well, gosh almighty. It almost felt like Steve was reborn. I don't think anybody ever beat a kid, but I think the reason God put that much flesh on your butt was so that your daddy could use it to make you realize you'd done something wrong. But when we moved to Drusilla, there was a Ward's Creek ran behind the house, and it was a big old creek. And Scott spent half his time down in that creek. And even after it rained, and I'd get concerned, I told him, I says, the next time you down in that creek, I'm going to whip your butt. And so it went about 2 weeks, and a lot of little kids were still playing in the creek. And I come home from work, and I drive up the driveway, and Scott's just sitting down there waiting, and I get out of the truck, and he runs up and he says, Dad, he says, will you go ahead and whip me now because I want to go in the creek? He didn't mind the whipping. He just didn't want the anticipation of that whipping. I remember when I was just a little boy, there was a black guy that lived in town. Everybody called him Uncle Page. And I don't know how he did it, but he lived in a little tin shack that was about 4 feet by 8 feet. And to sit in the summer, he had to take his chair out and sit in the yard to do it. And I used to go over there and talk to him a while. And I'll never forget one time I was kind of down a little bit. I don't even remember what it was for. He was asking me, what was the matter? And I said, I don't want to talk about it and all. He says, and he called me Junior. Everybody then back, he says, Junior, he said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, everybody got problems. And he said, if you could take your problems and throw them in a big old ring, and everybody else had to throw theirs in that big ring, and then you had to jump in that ring and get one problem, you fight like hell to get yours back. And he was right. Nobody gets out of this world unscathed. I mean, we've had, I don't think there's anything much worse than losing a son, but there's a lot of people that lost a son. In fact, God lost one, to be honest with you. But like you say, faith and friends will get you through a lot of things you never thought you'd get through. We made it a point every night we get with the kids and we talk about Steve. And a lot of people would say Steve and says, oh, Norman, I'm so sorry. And I said, no, Steve was part of our lives. It's not like it never existed, and if we don't talk about it, it won't be there. It's always, I think of Steve every day. The last time I saw him, I was sitting down on this fireplace, and he and I were sitting down talking. He'd been to LSU just a few days and talked about what he was doing and all. But when you have one tragedy, I kind of sat back there for a while and said, man, no, this ain't ever going to happen again. But it did happen again in a different way. But it did happen. So you never know. It's a day at a time, and
Life is precious.
life keeps going. Life keeps going. I learned a lesson I learned when I worked for DuPont. I was out in the field. We were making a big concrete pour. And a guy came out there and he said, you hear the news? And I says, no. He says, they just killed President Kennedy. And I said, you got to be kidding me. And I couldn't leave then until we got through. When we got through the pour, I walked back to my office and I turned on the radio. And they were talking, and 2 hours had passed, and I always thought I thought that I was always the hardest working guy on the job and everything else. In 2 hours' time, they'd already sworn in a new president, and the country never skipped a beat. And it made me realize I just ain't that damn important.
You know, we're talking about some of the adversities and challenges and just life events. But through all that and that pain, I'm sure people have leaned on you and Kay over the years for comfort and guidance for a lot of people. Would you say that that's accurate?
That's accurate. And we've tried to reach out to as many as we can that we know. I tell you who else is, not so much anymore that he's older, but when Sloan was younger, every time some kid got a spinal cord injury or something was in the hospitals, one of the therapists from the hospital would call and want Sloan to go visit with him. Because, you know, when you walk up to Sloan, you say, I know how you feel. He knows you don't know how he feels. But when a guy comes up there in a wheelchair that can do it, and he says, you know, I want you to know things are going to get better. I know how you feel. He knows. He knows. And one Thursday, I got tied up, and so I was a little late getting in, and Kay had gone to the apartment, so I dropped by the hospital to see Sloan. And he was laying in bed. I mean, and they'd taken all the patients that could get out of bed, they'd taken them to a movie to get them out. And the only ones were left were those like Sloan and those who had no idea where they were. And I walked in, I got off the floor, and I could hear all this hollering and screaming, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what the heck's going on? And it was all these kids who'd had serious brain injuries and all. And I walked over in Sloan's room, and I walked in, and he was just kind of laying in bed, you know, looking up, and I said, hey buddy, how things going? He says, I've been sitting here thinking, Dad. He says, you know, I am lucky. I still have a good mind. And I knew from that point on he was going to make it. I didn't know how or what, but if you think things are bad, sometimes you just need to look around.
What do you really want to be remembered by?
You know, I've tried to help a lot of kids. I think kids getting a good education is things. You know, when Steve got killed, I took all the funds that I had set aside from him that I was going to, you know, to go to high school, to go to college rather than everything else, and started a scholarship fund. And to date, there have been over 150 kids who have had the opportunity of using that scholarship. That's probably one of the things that I like. And I always try to be supportive of the church and the Catholic schools.
So what is it? I know Uncle Ed always wanted to live to 100. What's your timeline, Norm?
You know, I live a day at a time right now, and I mean, I feel like I'm in pretty good health, but you know, an old man's like an old truck. Something breaks, you fix it, and something else breaks. So when they quit making the part that breaks, then you're in trouble.
You feel like your legacy will be a pretty positive one when it comes to your grandkids, kids. I mean, what do you hope they remember about Norman?
I just hope they say he was a good guy. That's about it. I've tried to be good and fair with everybody. I've tried to help wherever I could and all. Like I say, I probably could have done some things better, but at the time I did the best I could, so I have no regrets. And look, how about living this last part of my life out? My son lives around the corner. My daughter lives down the street. My grandson lives across the street with 3 beautiful little great-grandchildren. I tell you what, I have no regrets in life about that. We had so many good times with so many good friends. When I ever think about getting down a little bit, I just think about what I've had and what I've been through. How lucky can you get?